Number 1. Corn Road. I ran away from home when I was 15 years old. My parents were horrible. As far as I know, they still are. I never reconciled with them and really have no desire to. I had a little bit of money saved up over the years, but not much. I knew it would be hard, but not nearly as hard as staying at home. I lived in the Midwest and was making my way towards California. I chose to hitchhike my way there, and there were a lot of adventures, plus some hard times along the way. I was walking down a long country road. If you've never been cross-country through the United States before, you might be surprised about how much corn there was. I was hiking along the road with what seemed like endless and endless miles of corn, but those roads were the best places to hitchhike along because of how nice country folk were about stopping and picking people up. And for the most part, hitchhiking is not the nightmare that Hollywood would like you to think that it was. But I had a horrifying experience once. I was walking at dusk, thinking it will be hard to find a ride that night. After a period of time, right after it got completely dark outside, a car passed me and then suddenly pulled over. They flashed their lights, which indicated I was getting a ride. I got into the passenger seat and thanked the man for the ride. Although older than me, he was a pretty young guy. He looked like he might have been around college age. I was wondering if he was on his way to school or something. We talked a bit and found out that we had a bit in common. He had actually left home also, although he was over 18, so he was not technically a runaway. But he had issues with his parents. He, unlike me, had a car though. Still, when he began talking about leaving, he seemed more upset about it than I did. For me it was easy, and I didn't miss my family at all. But his emotions seemed a lot more raw than mine were. He was more upset and more emotional. And the more we talked about it, the more I would start feeling concern. As we drove on, through the darkened fields of corn, I tried changing the subject a few times, but it would always drift back to what had upset us both enough to get us to run away. After we had driven and talked a little bit, I noticed headlights up in the distance coming in our direction. No big deal at first, until the driver began acting really weird. "Let me show you something," he told me. Before I could ask what, he reached over and turned his headlights off. I immediately panicked. It was too dark on that road with a car coming in our direction. I asked him what he was doing, and he told me this would be good for the both of us. I can't think about how terrified I was and actually be able to convey it, but I also didn't actually believe he was going to put us in danger. The headlights were getting closer, and the only thing that kept me from freaking out was the fact that we were in different lanes, but I was still very, very nervous. What happened next seemed like bullet time to me. The driver pulled into the other lane. I was shocked and I had almost no time to react, but I instinctively did. I grabbed the steering wheel and pushed it further towards the left. I know why I did it, because that was the direction it was going, and I wouldn't have to fight him to turn it. The car drove into the ditch, avoiding a collision. The other car drove past unscathed. I was expecting the driver to be mad at me for spoiling his suicide attempt. He was not, though. He began thanking me profusely, telling me he didn't know what had come over him. I helped get the car out of the ditch and back on the road. We drove for a day or two, actually, his moment of psychosis being just that. He didn't try it again. We parted ways a couple days later, and that was the last time I saw him. Number 2. Thief. I ran away from home when I was a teenager, and I had a nightmarish experience doing it. I didn't grow up in an abusive household or anything like that. My family was actually pretty well off. They were not mean to me, but they weren't really around a whole lot. Most of the things I needed were taken care of. but I really didn't get a lot of attention from them. In fact, I really couldn't even get in trouble. If I did something that was bad, it was normally forgotten about right away. I didn't grow up as a bratty kid though, so maybe that had something to do with it. I began hanging out with a group of guys who were always looking for some sort of excitement. After a while with them, I had started smoking and smoking pot. I don't consider either of those a big deal. It's just that I had changed a lot. There were things I did that I would never have considered earlier. And I found it weird, though, that my parents didn't seem to notice. And I guess, looking back on it, that may have been the thing that bothered me the most. Because I began doing other things and trying to make it obvious that I was doing them, to see if my parents would notice, but they never did. I guess that just got me into taking bigger risks. The group of friends and I began to steal things out of cars. They would break in to steal CDs to sell. They didn't do it because they needed the money, really. It was just because they were bored. But I didn't know that then. I was supposed to meet one of my buddies at a local store, and he didn't show up. When I used a payphone to call him, I found out that he had been arrested. That of course worried me, but I didn't think I should be concerned until I was walking back home and noticed 2 police cars outside of my house. As a 16-year-old, I guess I should have just taken my medicine, but I was scared then, and instead I ran off. I was too scared to even be in town, so when I got to the train station, I jumped on and bought myself a ticket all the way to the city. It might seem like I was overreacting a bit, but it didn't seem that way to me at the time. I had been stealing things for months, so I had months of anxiety about the possibility of getting caught. Now that we were caught, we really didn't know how bad it could be, and the last thing I wanted to do was get caught and go to jail. And yeah, I know, I should have thought about that before I went and started stealing things. If you were thinking that, you are absolutely right. I really was lost as to what to do. I couldn't go to my friends' houses. As far as I was aware, there could have been any number of police officers over at all their houses too, and I really didn't want to take any risks. I didn't know what to do when I got off the train. I got out and began wandering around, having no idea where to go, as I had never been in the city alone before. I also had no idea where to go. I also had no idea what to do. I spent the time walking around thinking about how stupid I had been and how it was completely stupid of me getting myself into this situation. Lost in my thoughts and my worries, I completely lost any sense of where I was going. The train station itself was not in the greatest part of town, so it was not like I had wandered into the bad part of town. I had a little bit of cash, so I decided to get myself a hotel room. I could then think out my strategy as to what to do next. I checked myself into a place, but was possibly more scared in there than I had been on the streets. But I was able to eventually get some sleep. I slept all the way until checkout time, and although I thought that I would simply try and go back home, at least the police couldn't still be there, I did end up changing my mind. There was no reason for my family not to turn me in, and even if they didn't, surely the school would when I went back to classes. I just found out that I couldn't go home because I didn't want to go to jail. Although I had no idea what I was going to do, I knew going home would not be it. I couldn't take going to jail. I only had a little bit of money left and knew that I couldn't get another hotel room. I needed to get food. I tried riding on the subway a lot, even taking naps on there when it was possible. But that was difficult with all the light and noise and movement. Plus I found out quickly that you couldn't stay on there all the time. Homeless people get shooed off, and not being able to get real rest made walking around even more miserable. I finally began sleeping in alleys. It was more difficult and scary than anything I had experienced before, but even though I didn't know it was possible, it could and did get scarier. On this night, I was looking for the right place to sleep. I made my way down an alley and found a wall to lean up against. It was a corner, so I felt comfortable resting into it. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep immediately, and it was mild enough weather-wise outside so that I was comfortable, enough to sleep pretty sound and deep. I was really confused when I got pulled out of sleep. I had been sleeping so deeply that I was groggy. There were hands on me, and they were pulling me up from the ground. Someone was holding me and shaking me and yelling at me in words that I couldn't understand. I tried getting away, but whoever it was had been holding me too strong. He kept yelling at me, but I could only make out the occasional word. All I could tell is that this was another homeless person who seemed to be angry at me for sleeping in the spot that he usually sleeps in. I struggled to get away, but this guy was much bigger than me. He kept slamming me up against the wall over and over again, but because I was in a corner, I couldn't get away. At one point, when I was hit up against the wall, my ankle bent the wrong way, and I fell down on my hands and knees. It gave me a moment to try and get away from the guy. I thought if he was only upset because I was in his spot, he would leave me alone as I ran off. However, as I was getting to my feet, I noticed the guy taking a pocket knife out of his jacket. I started thinking that he wanted revenge for me taking the spot, as weird as that seemed. However, he might have just been trying to get me to run away. And as I stumbled to my feet, I did my best to get away. But I was wrong. The guy, still babbling half incoherently, came after me. He obviously was not just trying to scare me off, he wanted to actually hurt me. I ran down to the street, which was residential, and then tried to run down over to the street to a busier road. There are a lot of good things about living in the city when you're not homeless, but the most convenient thing on this night were the availability of police cars. The raving lunatic was still after me when I noticed a cop car sitting in the parking lot of the 7-Eleven I had run up to. That was when it hit me. 2 weeks before, I had run away from the police, who were only there to help the people who me and my buddies had stolen from. I had run away from them, and now I needed their help. I could have ran into the store and just waited for the guy to leave me alone, but that is when I realized I had to make things right. I let the police officer know I was 16 years old and a runaway. Although he couldn't arrest me for the thefts outside of his jurisdiction, he did have to contact my parents. They came and got me, and I returned home, which was basically heaven compared to what I had been through. I pled guilty to the theft and had to perform community service and pay restitution, so I had to get a job. But I paid everything off and did all of my service to try and make up for the things that I had done. Number 3. Close call. When I was in high school, it was a small town in the far suburbs of a metropolis. I won't say exactly where, except the place was in a climate that was pretty cold in the winter. That's sort of important later in my story. I was 16 years old when this happened. My name is Sean. This happened in the early 90s. I went to school in a school that at first didn't have any LGBTQ individuals who were out of the closet. Of course, that was before Kyle transferred to the school. It was during his sophomore year, and he wasn't out then. But he came out during his junior year in a school newspaper article. When Kyle came out, there were a few threats from homophobic guys. I overheard people talking about beating him up, or even a few extreme things like hanging him. Oddly enough, Kyle didn't care. He had a lot of friends, many of them punk rockers. But beyond that, he really never seemed scared of anyone. During a school basketball game, a sophomore who had called him gay knocked him on the floor of the gym and laughed at him, calling him a fag. That sophomore had to go to the nurse's office after Kyle beat the living shit out of him. And when he did it, he apparently had appeared to snap, and since then everyone was too scared to ever say anything to piss him off. He got known as the school psycho, and he loved that. So why am I telling you about Kyle? Well, mostly because I envied him quite a bit. I was a sophomore then, and he was a junior. He was adorable. I mean, he looked almost exactly like a young Harry Connick Jr. In fact, once during a lip sync contest we had in school, he took place in it, and he got dressed up. I thought he looked so much like Harry Connick Jr. that I expected him to sing one of his songs, but he didn't. Kyle was absolutely comfortable about being gay. I had heard him talk about it before, and he never struggled with it when he realized it. He just accepted himself right away. All of his friends had no problem with it. No one really gave him a hard time about it. But despite the fact that we had many of the same friends, I didn't have as easy a time with it as he did. It was confusing to me at first, and I told a few of my friends that I thought I might be gay, but I also asked them not to tell anyone. Kyle and I literally sat beside each other in study hall and talked and joked around and gave the teacher a hard time, but I never told him. I mean, I thought maybe he'd be happy knowing he was not the only gay kid in school. I mean, this wasn't like now when kids are openly gay everywhere in school. But for some reason I never told him. I think the reason why could have been my parents. They were always making homophobic jokes, and I absolutely didn't want to tell them. I knew Kyle's family knew, and they didn't care. Despite the fact that we had a kid in school who was accepted not only by his family and his friends, I just couldn't convince myself that would ever happen for me too. I didn't find the same happiness with myself that he did, but I wanted to make it clear that none of my following choices were any fault of his. I doubt he would ever remember me today. Well, I met some gay guys using dating services. It was always older guys at first, and I lied about my age. It wasn't until after about a month of meeting these guys that I ended up meeting another kid about my age who was also pretending to be older in order to use the service. The guy I met, Terry, was absolutely a great difference than the older guys. We only fooled around once, but we decided we were better as friends, so I would hang out with him quite a bit. He didn't live at home, but didn't really give me a lot of information other than his phone number. I was lucky to make him as a friend because it didn't take long for me to be caught up using that dating line. When my parents found out, there was a huge fight, and yeah, it was over whether or not I was gay. I denied it at first, something I would never do today, but I ended up admitting to it eventually. I also snapped at my father when he used the word fag to describe me. I yelled at him to never use that word, and he slapped me for raising my voice to him. I lost it then. I started yelling and screaming really loud, and even my dad looked scared for a moment. I took a hammer out of his toolbox, which was in the room. I remember yelling at him to hit me again, and I would bust his head in. And then, out of control myself, I went to the door, slamming it, and stomped down the road. I called up Terry and asked him if I could sleep over at his place. I told him what happened and all. He said I could and that he would come and get me, which he did. I didn't have a car, but he told me he would pick me up. While I was waiting for him, I noticed my dad's pickup truck coming down the road. I felt a bit terrified because of what had happened, and I don't know exactly why I did it, but I decided to hide from him. I just had a strong feeling that that was what I should do. He drove by without knowing I was there. I left and moved in with my friends. Life took a lot of turns over the years, but those were not important. Years later, I got back in touch with my brother, and we talked about the night I left. We were talking about why he didn't talk to our dad anymore. Apparently, the night I left, he told the family no son of his was going to be gay. He took his gun and went after me. For years, my family actually thought that he had killed me and disposed of my body. I let my brother know that I had hidden when I noticed the truck coming. He told me that he truly believed that if I had not hidden, I would be dead.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here.
If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.